Before Salem became a symbol of hysteria, before witches were names written in court records and fear ruled entire towns, there was a woman whose voice history tried to erase. Her name was Tituba, an enslaved woman, a foreigner, and the first to be accused in the most infamous witch trial in American history. She did not arrive in Salem as a witch, nor as a criminal. She arrived in chains carrying stories, memories, and beliefs that Puritan America did not understand and refused to forgive. When strange illnesses spread among young girls in 1692, fear needed a face. Salem chose the easiest target, an enslaved woman with no protection, no power, and no place in white society. What followed was not justice but a spectacle: forced confessions, twisted testimonies, and a narrative written by men who already knew the verdict. Tituba's words were reshaped, her culture demonized, and her survival turned into proof of evil. Yet the real witchcraft was not hers. It was the fear of difference, the cruelty of slavery, and the manipulation of religion into a weapon. Tituba's story is not just about Salem, it is about how America learned to blame the powerless, and how one enslaved woman became the spark for a nightmare that would haunt the nation for centuries. Tituba's origins were wrapped in uncertainty long before Salem ever learned her name. Even today, historians argue over where she truly came from, and that uncertainty itself mirrors the way her identity was stripped, blurred, and reshaped by the system that enslaved her. She was not born into the rigid world of Puritan New England. She was brought into it, forced across cultural, linguistic, and spiritual boundaries that the colonists neither understood nor cared to understand. Some records suggest she was indigenous, possibly from South America or the Caribbean. Others claim African roots, but what remains clear is that she was not English, not white, and not free. In a society that defined humanity through race, religion, and obedience, those three facts alone placed her outside the circle of protection. Enslavement did not only take Tituba's freedom, it took her path. Whatever language she first spoke, whatever stories she heard as a child, whatever rituals shaped her sense of the world, all of it was considered dangerous or sinful by her owners. When she arrived in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, she entered a space where Puritan Christianity ruled every aspect of daily life. Prayer was law, scripture was authority, and anything unfamiliar was immediately suspect. Tituba's difference was visible even when she was silent. Her skin, her accent, her mannerisms marked her as other. She did not need to act strangely to be feared. Her existence alone challenged the narrow worldview of Salem. Cultural misunderstanding played a crucial role in how Tituba was perceived. Puritans believed the world was a battlefield between God and the devil, with Satan constantly seeking new ways to corrupt the faithful. Folklore, spiritual storytelling, herbal knowledge, and non-Christian traditions were not seen as cultural expressions but as evidence of demonic influence. If Tituba spoke of spirits, dreams, or healing practices from her homeland, these would not have been received as harmless tales. They would have been filtered through fear, suspicion, and religious paranoia. To the Puritans, a story could be a spell, a song could be a curse, and a memory could be proof of witchcraft. As an enslaved woman, Tituba occupied the lowest possible position in Salem's social hierarchy. She had no legal rights, no voice in court, and no one obligated to defend her. Her body belonged to her owner, and so did her labor, her time, and even her truth. When accusations began, this imbalance of power became lethal. Unlike white women who could rely on family names or social standing, Tituba had nothing but survival instinct. The system was never designed to hear her story as her own. It was designed to extract whatever narrative best served the fears of the community. Her foreignness made her useful. Salem needed an explanation for the unexplainable: children screaming, convulsing, claiming invisible attacks. The idea that such chaos could come from within their godly town was unbearable. Blaming an outsider offered relief. Tituba became a living symbol of everything Salem feared about the wider world beyond its border. She represented the unknown lands, the non-Christian beliefs, the races Puritans associated with darkness and sin. In their minds, witchcraft did not need to be invented. It was already attached to her identity. Language barriers likely deepened her vulnerability. If English was not her first language, every word she spoke would be open to misinterpretation. Questions asked by ministers and magistrates were not neutral. They were traps designed to confirm suspicion. Any hesitation could be read as guilt, any confusion as deception. Her inability to navigate Puritan legal and religious language meant she was constantly at a disadvantage. Even silence could be weaponized against her, turned into evidence of secret knowledge or hidden allegiance to the devil. Religion, race, and slavery merged into a single accusation. Tituba was not just accused of witchcraft. She was accused of being the kind of person who could be a witch. Her identity itself became the crime. The Puritan imagination painted her as someone closer to evil, simply because she was different. This allowed the community to ignore their own role in the hysteria. By focusing on Tituba, Salem avoided confronting the possibility that fear, repression and fanaticism were destroying them from within. Her enslaved status also meant she was accustomed to punish. Violence, threats, and control were daily realities. When accusations escalated, coercion followed naturally. Confession under duress was not a choice but a survival strategy. The fact that her later testimony would be shaped by what her interrogators wanted to hear is inseparable from her origins as an enslaved woman. She knew resistance could mean death. She knew compliance, even false compliance, might offer a chance to live. Tituba's background was rewritten by those in power. Her culture was transformed into superstition, her memory into evidence, her voice into a tool for the court. She became less a person and more a vessel through which Salem projected its nightmare. Her story shows how slavery did not merely exploit bodies but erased identities, turning complex human beings into symbols of fear. Long before the trials reached their peak, Tituba had already been condemned by her origins, by the color of her skin, by the land she came from, and by the beliefs she was forced to abandon, standing at the edge of a society that refused to see her as anything other than a threat waiting to be named. When Tituba entered the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, she stepped into the very heart of Salem's religious authority, a place where faith was not simply believed but enforced. Parris was not an ordinary man in the community. He was the spiritual leader of Salem Village, responsible for guiding souls, interpreting God's will, and identifying the presence of sin. His home was an extension of the church itself, governed by strict discipline, constant surveillance, and an obsession with moral purity. For an enslaved woman of foreign origin, living under such a roof meant existing in a space where every action was judged, and every difference was magnified. Daily life in Parris's household revolved around control and obedience. Prayer structured the day, scripture dictated behavior, and punishment reinforced authority. Tituba's role was to serve, to remain invisible unless needed, and to suppress anything that did not conform to Puritan expectations. She cooked, cleaned and cared for the household while absorbing the silent message that she did not belong. Her presence was tolerated as property, not accepted as a person. Any mistake, real or imagined, carried consequences, and mercy was rarely extended to someone of her status. Parris himself was a deeply anxious man, fearful of losing his position and obsessed with signs of spiritual corruption. He believed the devil was constantly at work in Salem, seeking entry through weakness or disobedience. This belief shaped how he viewed those under his roof. Tituba, as an enslaved woman with a background he did not understand, embodied the kind of threat he preached against from the pulpit. Even without evidence, her difference made her suspect in his eyes. The household atmosphere was charged with tension, where suspicion thrived, and compassion struggled to survive. The children in the Parris household, particularly young girls, occupied a strange position of power and vulnerability. They were expected to be obedient and pure, yet they were also closely watched for signs of spiritual danger. Tituba's interactions with them would later be distorted and weaponized, but even before the accusations, her proximity to them made her an easy target. Any unusual behavior from the children could be linked back to her, reinforcing the belief that she was a corrupting influence within the home. Isolation defined Tituba's existence in the household. She had no community, no family network, and no protection beyond the whims of her owner. Enslaved people were rarely seen as capable of innocence. Their suffering was normalized. When fear began to spread through Salem, that isolation became fatal. There was no one to speak on her behalf, no voice to counter the narrative forming around her. The walls of Parris's house became a cage, trapping her within a story she did not control. The power imbalance between Tituba and Reverend Parris cannot be overstated. He held authority, not only over her body, but over her fate. His words carried weight in court, in church, and in the community. If he believed she was dangerous, that belief alone was enough to shape events. When he began to suspect witchcraft, his suspicion carried the force of divine warning. Tituba was not confronting an individual accusation. She was confronting the combined power of religion, law and social hierarchy. Violence was a tool of control in the household. Historical accounts suggest that physical punishment was used to extract obedience, and later, confession. For Tituba, pain was not an abstract threat, but a lived reality. Under such conditions, truth becomes secondary to survival. When authority demands a story, the powerless learn to provide one. The environment of Parris's home trained her in this grim logic long before she faced formal interrogation. The household also served as the starting point of Salem's hysteria. The strange afflictions of the children began there, within walls already heavy with fear and repression. Instead of questioning their own beliefs, or considering natural explanations, Paris looked outward for a cause. Tituba's presence offered a convenient answer. The idea that evil had entered his home through an enslaved outsider fit perfectly within his worldview. This allowed him to maintain his image as a godly leader under attack rather than a man presiding over a household in crisis. Once accusations began, Paris did not act as a protector, he became an accuser. His authority ensured that Tituba's words would be filtered through his interpretation. Her responses were not recorded as she meant them, but as they were heard by men already convinced of her guilt. Living in his household meant that her story was never truly hers. It was shaped, corrected, and rewritten to support a narrative of spiritual warfare. Tituba's life in the Paris household reveals how private spaces can become engines of public terror. What began as domestic tension and religious rigidity evolved into accusations that consumed an entire community. The household was not just a backdrop to the witch trials, it was their incubator. Within those walls, fear was nurtured, difference was condemned, and an enslaved woman was transformed from servant to symbol of evil, her daily existence defined by obedience, suspicion, and the constant threat of punishment that left no room for safety, dignity, or escape. Puritan society was built on the belief that the world was a fragile structure constantly under attack by unseen forces. Every illness, every crop failure, every unexplained misfortune, carried a spiritual meaning. To the Puritans of New England, nothing happened by chance. God rewarded obedience and punished sin, while the devil searched relentlessly for openings through which he could enter their communities. This worldview created an atmosphere where fear was not an emotion but a guiding principle. Survival depended on identifying threats quickly, and the unknown was always the most dangerous threat of all. Non-European beliefs occupied a terrifying space in the Puritan imagination. Anything outside strict biblical interpretation was labeled suspicious, and anything suspicious was linked to Satan. Folklore, ancestral stories, herbal remedies and spiritual traditions from Africa, the Caribbean or indigenous cultures were not seen as cultural expressions, but as evidence of dark alliance. Puritans believed the devil disguised himself through foreign customs, corrupt languages and unfamiliar rituals. This belief system left no room for curiosity or understanding. Difference was automatically equated with danger. In this environment, storytelling itself became a potential crime. A tale meant to explain the natural world or preserve cultural memory could be twisted into an accusation of sorcery. A song could be labeled an incantation. A remedy could be interpreted as poison. Puritans lacked the framework to see non-European traditions as human knowledge, rather than spiritual rebellion. Their rigid religious structure demanded uniformity, and anything that did not fit was pushed into the realm of evil. Fear of the unknown was reinforced from childhood. Puritan children were taught that the devil targeted the weak, the sinful, and the disobedient. They learned to monitor their own thoughts for signs of corruption. This constant psychological pressure made them hypersensitive to imagined threat. When strange sensations or emotions arose, they did not look inward or seek natural explanations. They looked outward for an enemy. Someone different, someone marginal, someone already suspected became the logical answer. Race intensified this fear. Dark skin was often associated with darkness of the soul in Puritan ideology. Although not always stated openly, racial bias shaped how accusations formed. Enslaved people and foreigners were believed to be closer to the devil, simply because they were not Christian European. This belief was not based on evidence, but on theology twisted to justify slavery and colonial dominance. Fear of the unknown became a tool to reinforce existing power structures. Religious leaders amplified this fear through sermons that emphasized spiritual warfare. They warned congregations that Satan was active, clever and relentless. The community was told that vigilance was a moral duty. Questioning accusations could be framed as questioning God himself. This created a closed system where fear fed on itself. Once suspicion entered the community, it spread rapidly, validated by religious authority and reinforced by social pressure. The unknown also threatened Puritan control over knowledge. Non-European belief systems offered alternative explanations for illness, nature and human behavior. Accepting these explanations would weaken the Church's monopoly on truth. By labeling foreign beliefs as witchcraft, Puritans protected their authority. Suppression of alternative knowledge became a form of self-defense, preserving a worldview that depended on absolute certainty. In moments of crisis, fear demanded simple answers. Complex explanations required humility and doubt, qualities the Puritan system discouraged. When children began experiencing fits and convulsions, the community did not consider medical or psychological causes. They considered possession. The unknown sensations within the human body were externalized and blamed on witchcraft. This process transformed fear into accusation, and accusation into certainty. For enslaved people like Tituba,
This environment was lethal. Her cultural background, already misunderstood, became proof of guilt. The very aspects of her identity that connected her to her past were reinterpreted as signs of corruption. The Puritan fear of the unknown allowed no distinction between cultural difference and moral threat. Once labeled dangerous, there was no path back to innocence. This fear also created permission for cruelty. If the unknown was the devil's work, then extreme measures were justified. Interrogation, torture, and public humiliation were framed as necessary acts of protection. Compassion became weakness, and mercy became risk. The community believed that failing to eliminate the threat would invite God's punishment upon them all. Puritan fear of the unknown reveals how a society can turn imagination into evidence. When belief replaces reason, suspicion becomes true. The witch trials were not born from supernatural events, but from a culture trained to fear different. In that culture, the unfamiliar was not something to learn from but something to destroy. And once that logic took hold, it did not stop at Tituba, but expanded outward, consuming neighbors, families, and eventually the moral foundation of Salem itself.
The strange illnesses that overtook the young girls of Salem did not arrive with clarity or explanation. They began quietly, almost innocently, with complaints that could not be measured or easily dismissed. Sudden screams echoed through homes, bodies twisted into unnatural shapes, limbs jerked without control, and voices cried out in terror at things no one else could see. These episodes appeared and vanished without warning, leaving families confused and frightened. In a society already conditioned to see divine meaning in every event, such unexplained behavior could not remain neutral for long. The girls described sensations that defied ordinary language. They claimed to feel invisible hands pinching, biting, and choking them. They spoke of sharp pains without visible wounds, of shadows moving along walls, of figures hovering just beyond reach. At times they collapsed into fits, at other times they froze, unable to speak or move. Their suffering appeared real, and the fear it inspired spread rapidly through Salem village. Parents, neighbors, and ministers gathered to witness these events, searching desperately for an answer that fit their understanding of the world. Medical knowledge in colonial New England was limited and deeply intertwined with religious belief. Doctors could offer little beyond speculation, and when physical causes could not be identified, spiritual explanations rushed in to fill the void. Illness was not merely a biological condition, it was a message. The question was not what was happening but why God was allowing it. The possibility that stress, repression, or psychological trauma could manifest physically was not part of Puritan thought. Instead, the devil became the most logical explanation. The attention given to the girls intensified their experiences. Every fit drew an audience. Every scream was carefully observed. Every word recorded and repeated. The girls learned, consciously or not, that their suffering carried power. Adults listened to them, believed them, and feared what they described. In a society where children were usually silent and obedient, this sudden authority was extraordinary. Their voices shaped events far beyond the household, transforming private distress into public crisis. Social tension within Salem played a silent role in the outbreak. The village was divided by disputes over land, money, church leadership, and personal grudges. These conflicts created an undercurrent of anxiety that had no acceptable outlet. The girls, living within rigid expectations of obedience and emotional restraint, absorbed this pressure. Their bodies became the stage on which the community's unspoken fears were performed. What could not be expressed openly emerged through convulsions and cries. Once the idea of witchcraft entered the conversation, the girls' experiences were reframed. Their pain was no longer random or mysterious, it had an enemy. Each episode was interpreted as an attack, each symptom as evidence of supernatural assault. This shift gave the community a sense of control. If witches were responsible, then witches could be named, tried, and punished. Fear became actionable, and uncertainty transformed into purpose. The girls were repeatedly questioned about what they saw and felt. Leading questions guided their answers, shaping their descriptions toward familiar narratives of demonic activity. When asked if they saw spirits, they began to see them. When asked to identify faces, those faces appeared. The boundary between suggestion and experience blurred, reinforced by the belief that the devil could manipulate perception. The more the girls spoke, the more detailed their visions became, feeding the growing hysteria. Religious leaders treated the girls' suffering as confirmation of their sermons. They had long warned that Satan was active in Salem, and now there was proof. Public fasts and prayers were declared, not to question the accusations but to strengthen resistance against the supposed enemy. Doubt was dangerous. To question the girls' experiences was to risk aligning oneself with evil. This silenced skepticism and allowed the narrative to harden into certainty. The illnesses also reflected the harsh emotional environment imposed on Puritan children. Joy was suspect, play was limited, and fear was a constant companion. Children were taught that they were born sinful and that eternal punishment awaited those who strayed. Such beliefs weighed heavily on young minds. The strange symptoms may have been expressions of internal conflict, guilt and terror, but Puritan society lacked the tools to interpret them that way. As the episodes continued, they became more dramatic. The girls accused invisible figures of tormenting them during court proceedings, reacting violently when alleged witches entered the room. These performances reinforced belief in witchcraft and justified increasingly severe action. The courtroom became another stage where suffering and accusation fed each other, escalating the crisis beyond control. The community's response to the illnesses revealed its deepest fears. Rather than protecting the girls from public scrutiny, Salem placed them at the center of its moral panic. Their pain was used to validate arrests, imprisonments and executions. The original question of why the girls were suffering was replaced by the demand to identify who was responsible. These strange illnesses were never simply about the girls themselves. They were symptoms of a society under extreme pressure, shaped by rigid beliefs and unresolved tensions. The girls' bodies became the language through which Salem expressed its dread of disorder, difference, and divine punishment. Once that language was accepted, it reshaped reality, turning fear into accusation and illness into evidence, setting the stage for a tragedy that would grow far beyond the suffering that first appeared in a small village, carried on the fragile shoulders of children whose cries were transformed into the spark that ignited one of the darkest chapters in American history. Tituba became the first accused, not because evidence pointed to her, but because fear required a beginning. Salem needed someone it could safely blame. When the strange illnesses of the young girls could no longer be ignored, pressure mounted on the adults to identify a cause. Silence was unacceptable, uncertainty dangerous. The community demanded a name, a source, an enemy. In that moment, the social hierarchy of Salem made the decision almost inevitable. An enslaved woman, foreign, powerless, and already viewed with suspicion, stood closest to the edge of acceptable humanity. The accusation did not arise from a careful investigation. It emerged from suggestion, coercion, and expectation. Reverend Samuel Parris and other authority figures began questioning the girls, framing their questions in ways that narrowed the range of possible answers. When asked who was hurting them, the girls did not choose random. They chose someone whose guilt would not threaten the structure of Salem society. Accusing Tituba did not endanger powerful families or respected church members. It confirmed existing beliefs about outsiders and reinforced the moral order. Once her name was spoken, it carried immediate weight. In Puritan culture, accusation itself was a form of evidence. Being named as a witch meant that suspicion hardened instantly into assumed guilt. Tituba was arrested and brought before magistrates who were not seeking truth, but confirmation. The legal process was shaped by theology, not fairness. The court already believed witches existed, already believed Satan was active, and already believed that enslaved people and foreigners were more susceptible to his influence. During her interrogation, Tituba faced an impossible situation. She was questioned by men who controlled her fate, men who believed they were instruments of God. Denial offered no safety. Other accused women who denied involvement were beaten, imprisoned and eventually executed. Confession, however false, offered the possibility of survival. Tituba learned quickly what kind of answers were desired. Her responses were shaped by fear, pain and the instinct to stay alive. Violence played a critical role in extracting her confession. Accounts suggest she was beaten by Parris before she ever stood before the court. This brutality set the tone for everything that followed. Under physical and psychological pressure, her words became less a reflection of her beliefs and more a mirror of Puritan fear. She spoke of black dogs, red cats, flying on sticks, and signing the devil's book, not because these things were real to her, but because they were real to the imagination of her interrogators. Her confession transformed the trials. Before Tituba, accusations were vague, symptoms unexplained. After her confession, Salem had a narrative. She did not simply admit guilt, she provided a story filled with dramatic detail, a story that matched sermons and folklore already familiar to the court. This made her confession irresistible. It validated the belief that Salem was under coordinated attack by witches, not isolated acts of mischief. By confessing, Tituba shifted her role from accused to witness. She named others,
describing a network of witches conspiring against the godly community. This was exactly what the magistrates wanted to hear. It justified further arrests and expanded the scope of the trials. Her testimony gave the hysteria momentum. Each new accusation reinforced the belief that the threat was widespread and urgent. Her race and enslaved status shaped how her confession was received. The court did not treat her words with skepticism. Instead, they saw her as a vessel through which Satan spoke. Her imagined closeness to the devil made her testimony seem authentic. The idea that a powerless enslaved woman could manipulate the entire court was unthinkable to them. They believed she was revealing truth, not performing survival. Tituba's position as the first accused also protected her in a cruelly ironic way. Those who confessed were often spared execution, while those who maintained innocence were condemned. By aligning herself with the narrative of witchcraft, Tituba avoided the gallows. Her survival, however, came at the cost of her dignity and her truth. She remained imprisoned long after others were freed, forgotten once her usefulness ended. The act of accusing Tituba revealed more about Salem than about her. It showed how quickly fear overrides justice, how power seeks the weakest target, how systems built on inequality collapse inward under pressure. She was not chosen because she was dangerous, but because she was disposable. Her life mattered least in a society that measured worth through race, freedom and conformity. Being the first accused also fixed Tituba's place in history in a distorted form. For centuries her name has been associated with witchcraft rather than survival. The nuance of her situation, the violence she endured and the manipulation she faced, were often ignored. She became a symbol stripped of context, remembered more for what she was accused of than for what was done to her. Tituba's accusation opened the door to mass hysteria. Once the first name was spoken and believed, others followed rapidly. Neighbors accused neighbors, children accused adults, servants accused masters. The boundaries that once held Salem together dissolved. What began with an enslaved woman quickly consumed the entire community, proving that the system that allowed her to be accused so easily could not contain the consequences of its own fear. Her story as the first accused is not a tale of guilt, but of vulnerability. It exposes how societies create enemies to avoid confronting themselves. Tituba did not introduce witchcraft to Salem. Salem introduced witchcraft to itself, using her as the starting point. Her accusation was the spark, but the fire was already waiting, built from fear, repression, and a desperate need to believe that evil lived somewhere else rather than within their own walls. Tituba's confession did not emerge from free will or belief in guilt. It was forged under pressure that stripped away any possibility of choice. In Salem, confession was not a moral act but a survival mechanism, especially for someone enslaved and already accustomed to violence. The moment she was accused, the path before her narrowed sharply. Denial meant continued punishment, isolation and almost certain death. Compliance, even if it required surrendering truth itself, offered the faint hope of staying alive. Physical coercion played a decisive role. Accounts from the period indicate that Reverend Samuel Parris beat Tituba before formal interrogation began. This violence was not an aberration but an accepted tool of control within slavery. Pain was used to discipline bodies and break resistance. When interrogators later questioned her, they did so knowing she was already conditioned to fear authority. Every question carried an implicit threat. Every silence invited further punishment. Under such conditions, the idea of a voluntary confession loses all meaning. Psychological pressure compounded the physical abuse. Tituba faced a panel of magistrates, ministers and community leaders, who believed they were acting on God's behalf. They spoke with certainty, authority and moral superiority. She stood alone, surrounded by men who controlled her fate, and believed her soul was already compromised. The imbalance was absolute. She was not asked to tell her story. She was forced to fit her words into a narrative that had already been written. The structure of the questioning itself was coercive. Interrogators did not ask open-ended questions. They asked leading ones, designed to confirm guilt, rather than explore truth. When she denied involvement, the pressure increased. When she hesitated, suspicion deepened. Only when her answers aligned with their expectations did the atmosphere soften. This taught her quickly what kind of story was required. Confession became less about accuracy and more about performance. Fear of execution loomed over every exchange. Salem had already demonstrated that denial did not protect the accused. Women who maintained innocence were hanged, while those who confessed were often spared. This brutal logic was not hidden. It was visible, understood and enforced. Tituba learned that admitting to witchcraft, no matter how false, could preserve her life. In a system where truth led to death and lies offered survival, morality was a luxury she could not afford. Her confession was shaped by Puritan expectations of witchcraft. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of animal familiars, of flying through the air, of conspiracies against the godly. These details did not originate from her culture. They originated from English folklore and Puritan sermons. By repeating them, she validated the beliefs of her interrogators. Her words became echoes of their fears rather than expressions of her own experience. This dynamic reveals the cruelty of coerced confession. Tituba was not revealing hidden evil. She was reflecting back what the court wanted to see. Her testimony became a mirror, showing Salem its own imagination dressed as evidence. The more dramatic her confession, the more satisfied the magistrates became. Each fantastical detail strengthened their conviction that they were uncovering a vast satanic plot. Pain did not end with confession. Even after admitting guilt, Tituba remained in prison. Confession did not restore her humanity or grant freedom. It merely changed her role from accused to tool. She was used to identify others, to expand the trials, to justify further arrests. Her continued suffering underscores the emptiness of the promise that confession would bring mercy. Survival was relative, limited to avoiding the gallows rather than achieving safety. The psychological toll of coerced confession is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Being forced to deny one's own reality, to speak lies as truth, to participate in the destruction of others under threat of violence, fractures identity. Tituba's voice, already marginalized by slavery, was further distorted until it no longer belonged to her. She became a character in a story told by others, her words stripped of context and agency. Her confession also set a dangerous precedent. It established a template that others would be pressured to follow. Once the court accepted her narrative, future accused were expected to provide similar details. Those who could not or would not were seen as stubborn, deceptive, or more deeply corrupted. Coerced confession became institutionalized, a ritual of compliance that fueled the trial's expansion. The court treated Tituba's confession as proof of the system's righteousness, rather than evidence of its brutality. They did not question why an enslaved woman under threat would say whatever was required. They did not consider the role of fear and violence in shaping her words. Instead, they interpreted her confession as divine confirmation that they were fighting a real and present evil. This blindness reveals how power protects itself. Acknowledging coercion would have undermined the legitimacy of the trial. It would have exposed the court as perpetrators of injustice, rather than defenders of faith. By accepting coerced confession as truth, Salem preserved its moral certainty at the cost of human life. Tituba's coerced confession stands as one of the clearest examples of how systems of oppression manufacture guilt. It shows how slavery, racism, and religious extremism combine to erase truth and replace it with spectacle. Her words were never free. They were shaped by pain, fear, and the instinct to survive in a world where honesty was punished and submission rewarded. The tragedy of her confession lies not only in what she said but in why she said it. It was not an admission of evil but a response to cruelty. It reveals a society willing to torture the powerless into validating its fears. Through her forced testimony, Salem heard what it wanted to hear and called it justice, while an enslaved woman paid the price for a narrative that was never hers to begin with.
Tituba's testimony reshaped the Salem Witch Trials in ways that few could have predicted at the moment she spoke. Before her confession, the accusations were chaotic and uncertain, rooted mainly in unexplained suffering and fearful speculation. After she testified, the trials gained structure, direction, and momentum. Her words did not merely answer questions. They created a framework that allowed the court to believe it was uncovering a coordinated and deliberate threat rather than isolated incidents of misfortune. By describing witchcraft as an organized conspiracy, Tituba provided the authorities with exactly what they needed. She spoke of multiple witches, of secret meetings, of a larger plan aimed at destroying the godly community of Salem. This transformed the trials from a local concern into a perceived spiritual war. The idea that witches were working together justified broader arrests and harsher measures. Fear expanded outward, no longer confined to a single household or a handful of individuals. Her testimony validated the magistrates' deepest fears and sermons they had preached for years. Religious leaders had warned that Satan did not work alone, that he gathered followers and built networks to undermine God's people. Tituba's words appeared to confirm this belief. The court no longer felt it was guessing. It believed it was uncovering hidden truth. This sense of certainty removed any remaining restraint. If Salem was under organized attack, extreme action became not only acceptable but necessary. The details she provided became a template for future confessions and accusations. Animal familiars, the devil's book, spectral appearances and secret gatherings became recurring elements in testimony. Accusers and accused alike began to speak the same language, reinforcing the illusion of consistency. This repetition created a false sense of credibility. Similar stories were taken as confirmation rather than evidence of coercion or suggestion. Spectral evidence gained new legitimacy through her testimony. The idea that spirits could torment victims while remaining invisible to others became central to the trials. This meant that proof no longer required physical evidence or evidence. A claim of seeing a specter was enough. Reality itself became unstable, shaped by fear and belief rather than facts. Tituba's testimony helped open this door, allowing imagination to function as legal evidence. Her role as a witness against others shifted the balance of power. Once she began naming names, the trials accelerated rapidly. Accusations multiplied, spreading through families, neighborhoods, and social classes. No one felt safe. Even respected members of the community found themselves vulnerable. The logic that allowed an enslaved woman to be accused so easily now threatened everyone. Ironically, Tituba's testimony also exposed the court's dependence on the very people it claimed to distrust. The magistrates relied heavily on the words of an enslaved woman they considered morally inferior and spiritually compromised. They did not question this contradiction. Her supposed closeness to the devil made her testimony seem more valuable, not less. This twisted logic allowed the court to treat her as both untrustworthy and authoritative at the same time. The emotional intensity of her testimony fueled public hysteria. Crowds attended hearings, listened to accusations, and watched accused witches react in terror. Fear became communal, shared and reinforced through public spectacle. Each session confirmed the belief that Salem was surrounded by hidden enemies. Doubt faded as fear hardened into certainty. Her testimony also shifted blame away from structural issues within Salem. Economic inequality, land disputes, religious infighting and personal grudges disappeared from the narrative. Witchcraft became a convenient explanation that absolved the community of responsibility. By focusing on an external enemy, Salem avoided confronting its own divisions and failures. The trials began to follow the path her testimony outlined. Once the idea of a network of witches took hold, it demanded constant expansion. Each accused person was pressured to name others, repeating the cycle. Confession became contagious. Silence was dangerous. Denial fatal. The system fed on itself, driven by the logic that if witches were everywhere then anyone could be one. Tituba's testimony also influenced how guilt and innocence were defined. Innocence no longer meant the absence of wrongdoing. It meant alignment with the court's narrative. Those who confessed and cooperated were seen as redeemable, while those who resisted were seen as defiant and therefore more dangerous. Truth was replaced by obedience. Her influence lingered even after her direct involvement faded. The language she introduced continued to shape proceedings long after she was no longer central to them. The trials had acquired a script, and it no longer required her presence to continue. The machinery of accusation moved forward on its own. The way her testimony was used reveals the fragile nature of justice under fear. A coerced confession became the foundation for legal decisions that destroyed lives. Instead of prompting caution, the extremity of her story encouraged escalation. The more unbelievable the claims, the more convinced the court became that it was facing a supernatural threat. Tituba did not control the impact of her testimony. Once spoken, her words were no longer hers. They were taken, interpreted and deployed by those in power to serve their purposes. Her voice became a tool of the court, detached from her intentions and shaped into a weapon against the community itself. Through her testimony, Salem learned how easily fear could be organized, how quickly belief could replace evidence, and how a single coerced narrative could reshape an entire legal process. What began as an attempt to survive interrogation became the blueprint for mass hysteria, guiding the trials down a path that would not stop until the damage was irreversible. The intersection of race, slavery and scapegoating played a central role in how Tituba was targeted and how the Salem Witch Trials escalated. In 1692, colonial New England was a society defined by hierarchy and rigid social structures, where whiteness conferred protection, status, and authority, and where being enslaved or racially different placed a person at the very bottom. Tituba, as an enslaved woman of uncertain origin, embodied everything that Puritan society associated with vulnerability, marginalization, and foreignness. Her race and enslaved status made her an easy target for fears that might have been directed at anyone who challenged the social or religious order, but who could not resist the community's power. Enslaved people in Salem were considered property first and human beings second. Their lives, voices, and experiences were devalued to such an extent that society could ignore injustice inflicted upon them without moral conflict. In Tituba's case, this meant that when hysteria rose, she could be accused without evidence, and her survival depended entirely on the whims of those who controlled her. The court did not question whether an enslaved woman could manipulate the events around her. Instead, her status made it plausible to the Puritan imagination that she could act in concert with dark forces. In their eyes, the enslaved were inherently more susceptible to sin, more likely to consort with the devil, and therefore naturally culpable when misfortune struck. Race and foreign origin compounded this perception. Tituba was not only enslaved, she was culturally and ethnically distinct from the Puritan majority. Her language, customs, and beliefs were unfamiliar and therefore suspect. To the Puritans, unfamiliarity was dangerous, and difference was proof of corruption. Her identity became a canvas onto which the community projected fears about outsiders, about the unknown, and about those who were not bound by their strict moral code. She was both literally and symbolically other, an ideal scapegoat in a society that sought someone to blame for unexplained suffering. Scapegoating in Salem followed predictable patterns. When misfortune or uncertainty strikes, communities under pressure often seek an individual who embodies everything they fear. That person becomes responsible not because of evidence, but because of accessibility, difference, and perceived threat. Tituba fit every criterion. She was visible yet powerless, present yet marginal, capable of being accused without social or political repercussions for those levying the accusation. In a society obsessed with moral order, eliminating a figure like Tituba offered reassurance to those who feared disorder, even if it meant punishing the innocent. Slavery amplified her vulnerability. As property, she had no legal standing to defend herself. Her testimony, her experiences, and even her bodily autonomy were subject to the control of her owner and the courts. When accusations arose, she was isolated, her support networks non-existent, and her options severely limited. The coercive mechanisms of slavery, physical punishment, psychological pressure, and the constant threat of violence were instrumental in shaping her behavior, including the coerced confession that would become central to the trial. Her enslaved status made her testimony malleable, allowing the court to mold her words to fit a narrative of evil without accountability. The racialized perception of Tituba also influenced public interpretation of the trial. Many colonists assumed that someone non-European would be morally and spiritually weaker, more likely to act against God's law. This assumption reinforced the idea that the devil targeted outsiders, not insiders, creating a framework in which her race justified her guilt. In this sense, the trials were not only about witchcraft but about maintaining social hierarchy. By accusing and controlling someone like Tituba, the Puritan community reaffirmed its power and cohesion, establishing a clear boundary between the civilized and the dangerous other. Scapegoating extended beyond her individual experience. Tituba's accusation allowed the community to deflect attention from internal tensions, such as land disputes, church politics, and social rivalry. By focusing on an enslaved outsider, the community avoided examining its own conflicts, anxieties, and failures. Witchcraft became a socially convenient explanation for events that were otherwise incomprehensible or uncomfortable, and Tituba's race and status made her the ideal vessel for the projection of collective fear. Her role in the trials demonstrates how oppression compounds vulnerability. Being enslaved made her powerless to resist the court. Being racially and culturally different made her more suspect. Being forced to confess under threat ensured that her words would reinforce, rather than challenge, the community's prejudice. The combination of these factors created a perfect storm in which one woman could be blamed for events far beyond her control, illustrating how systemic inequality fuels the use of marginalized individuals as scapegoats. The interplay of race, slavery, and scapegoating also shaped the language and imagery of the trials. When Tituba confessed, she spoke in terms the Puritan authorities expected: encounters with spirits, satanic rituals, and conspiracies against the community. Her testimony was filtered through the lens of racial and cultural difference, exaggerated to fit the fears of the colonists. The exoticized perception of her background gave credibility to the most fantastical elements of her confession. Her identity made her narrative both believable and dangerous, heightening the hysteria. The consequences of this dynamic extended beyond Tituba herself. By making an enslaved, racially othered woman the center of the initial accusations, the court established a precedent that the powerless would bear the burden of communal fear. Subsequent accusations followed a similar pattern. Those with less social power, often women servants or individuals already marginalized, were disproportionately targeted. The logic of scapegoating institutionalized injustice, ensuring that fear and prejudice would guide legal proceedings rather than evidence or fairness.
Tituba's experience illustrates the lethal combination of racial prejudice, social hierarchy and community hysteria. Her story is not simply one of individual misfortune but of systemic oppression, demonstrating how societies can weaponize difference and powerlessness to reinforce control. Her coerced confession, shaped by fear and societal expectation, became the catalyst for a series of events that magnified these dynamics across Salem, showing how race and slavery were central to the functioning of the witch trials themselves. Even after the trials ended, the memory of Tituba was distorted by the same forces of scapegoating and racial bias that had shaped her life. Historical narratives often emphasized her exoticness, her supposed complicity and her connection to witchcraft, obscuring the systemic pressures that made her actions understandable. Her identity as an enslaved woman of color was continually reframed as moral or spiritual weakness, rather than as the product of a society structured to exploit, isolate, and silence her. This distortion reflects how race and slavery continue to shape historical memory, ensuring that marginalized voices are filtered through dominant perspectives rather than heard in their own terms. Tituba's disappearance from the official records is one of the most haunting aspects of her story, highlighting how easily the lives of marginalized people could be erased in colonial America. After her central role in the Salem Witch Trials, she vanishes from court documents and community accounts, leaving historians to piece together her fate from fragmentary evidence and speculation. This absence is not merely a gap in paperwork, it reflects the broader social and cultural mechanisms that allowed the stories of enslaved people, women and racial minorities to be ignored, silenced or deliberately obscured. Her disappearance underscores the power of historical narratives to shape memory, identity and justice. The circumstances of her vanishing are entwined with her status as an enslaved woman. Unlike white accused witches who were named, recorded and remembered, Tituba had no family name, no property and no social standing to anchor her in the historical record. Her survival depended on her owner and on the court's decisions, neither of which provided long-term protection. Once her testimony had served its purpose in escalating the trials, there was little incentive for the authorities to continue documenting her life. She had been useful, now she could be forgotten. In a society that valued property over personhood, her erasure was both practical and symbolic. Historians have debated what became of Tituba after her imprisonment. Some accounts suggest she may have been released from jail and returned to servitude, possibly in another household or town. Others claim she was sold or transferred, moving further into obscurity. The lack of concrete evidence makes it impossible to know her final fate, but the absence itself tells a story. It reflects a system in which enslaved people were considered interchangeable, where their experiences mattered only insofar as they could serve the needs of the community, the court, or their owners. Once that service was complete, documentation and recognition ceased. Her disappearance also illustrates the ways in which social and racial hierarchies shape historical memory. White accused witches, particularly women of property or standing, were written about extensively, their trials documented in detail, their confessions published, and their punishments remembered. By contrast, Tituba's life was considered peripheral. Her identity as an enslaved woman of color meant that her survival, suffering and testimony could be erased without challenging the moral or social order. The story of Salem was written by those in power, and her absence shows who was considered worth remembering and who was disposable. The consequences of this erasure extend beyond historical curiosity. By disappearing from records, Tituba was denied agency over how her story would be told. Later retellings of the Salem witch trials frequently misrepresented her, emphasizing exoticism, superstition or complicity, rather than acknowledging her coercion and the systemic forces that shaped her action. Her erasure allowed myths and stereotypes to fill the gaps, turning a survivor of violence and oppression into a symbol of witchcraft in popular imagination, divorced from the realities of her life as an enslaved woman navigating a hostile environment. This absence also highlights the vulnerability of marginalized voices in general. Enslaved people, indigenous individuals, women without property and people of color were rarely given the means to record their own story. Court records, diaries and published accounts were controlled by those in power, and anything that deviated from the dominant narrative could be ignored or suppressed. Tituba's disappearance is emblematic of this broader trend, showing how history itself can participate in the oppression it claims to describe. Moreover, her erasure complicates attempts to understand the trials as a social phenomenon. By focusing on the stories of more documented individuals, historians risk missing critical perspectives on how fear, coercion and inequality intersected. Tituba's testimony played a central role in shaping the course of the trials, yet her subsequent disappearance leaves an incomplete picture of the human consequences of those events. Without her, the story of Salem is skewed toward those already empowered, minimizing the experiences of those most victimized by hysteria and injustice. Her vanishing also underscores the intersection of fear and power in Salem. Once she was no longer needed to validate the court's narrative, her presence became inconvenient. She had survived the immediate danger, but her existence reminded the community of the mechanisms of coercion and inequality that had made her testimony necessary. Forgetting her allowed the society to maintain its self-image as righteous and orderly, while erasing the uncomfortable truth that its legal and religious systems depended on the manipulation and oppression of the powerless. The symbolic significance of her disappearance continues to resonate. Tituba's absence in historical records is a reminder that silenced voices are not merely forgotten, they shape the way history is remembered. The narrative of Salem has often centered on moral panic, religious extremism and community dynamics, but without Tituba's perspective, it risks ignoring the lived realities of enslavement, race and coercion that were central to the event. Her erasure is itself a form of testimony, revealing what the society valued, who it protected, and who it deemed expendable. In the centuries since the trials, historians and writers have sought to recover Tituba's story, filling in gaps through inference, context, and imagination. These efforts acknowledge that her disappearance from the record was not a neutral absence, but a deliberate erasure shaped by social hierarchy and systemic oppression. By piecing together her likely experiences, scholars attempt to restore her agency and highlight the structural injustices that allowed her to be both central to the trials and almost invisible afterward. Her disappearance also emphasizes the fragility of historical truth when filtered through power. When documents are lost, voices are silenced, or perspectives are ignored, the historical narrative becomes incomplete, distorted, or mythological. Tituba's story demonstrates the consequences of this fragility. What survives about her is mediated by the authorities who controlled her life, by the cultural lens that labeled her foreign and dangerous, and by later generations who romanticized or demonized her. In this sense, her disappearance from the record is a critical part of understanding the trials themselves. Ultimately, Tituba's vanishing serves as both a caution and a lesson. It warns that marginalized individuals are particularly vulnerable to being written out of history, and that absence can be as telling as presence. It challenges historians to consider who controls narrative, whose stories are preserved, and whose are erased. By reflecting on her disappearance, it becomes possible to see not only the social and racial hierarchies of Salem, but also the broader mechanisms of historical memory that continue to shape which voices are heard and which are lost, highlighting the need to critically examine the gaps, silence, and omissions that define our understanding of the past.
The legacy of Tituba is far more than the story of a single accused witch. It is a reflection of how fear, power, and prejudice can combine to shape history and memory. Her life and experiences reveal the intersections of race, gender, slavery, and religion in colonial America, demonstrating how individuals at the margins were made to bear the weight of societal anxieties. While the Salem witch trials have often been remembered for their moral panic and community hysteria, Tituba's story forces us to confront the human consequences of these events and the mechanisms that allowed an enslaved woman to become the center of one of America's most infamous legal and social crises. Despite being accused, imprisoned, and coerced into confessing acts she did not commit, Tituba lived when many others did not. This survival, however, was not freedom in any meaningful sense. She remained enslaved, her autonomy constrained by social and legal hierarchies that continued to dehumanize her. Yet her ability to navigate such an impossible situation demonstrates both resilience and strategic thinking. By providing the testimony that authorities demanded, she avoided execution, though at the cost of her truth, dignity, and control over her own narrative. This act, while coerced, reflects a deep understanding of the structures that governed her life and the limited options available to someone in her position. Tituba's story also exposes the central role of race in shaping fear and scapegoating. As an enslaved woman of likely African or indigenous descent, she was perceived as both culturally and morally other. Her difference became evidence of guilt, making her an ideal target for the anxieties of a community in crisis. In a society obsessed with moral and spiritual purity, her foreignness was equated with susceptibility to sin and to the devil himself. This racialized perception not only led to her accusation but also shaped how her testimony was received and interpreted, highlighting how prejudice and systemic inequality can determine who is blamed when fear spreads. Her experience illuminates the function of slavery in early American society. Enslaved people were denied legal protection, agency, and voice. They existed within a framework in which their bodies and labor were controlled, their words could be coerced, and their lives could be sacrificed to maintain social order. Tituba's coerced confession demonstrates how slavery created conditions in which accusations could be manipulated, forcing the powerless to serve as instruments for the powerful. Her story is a reminder that the Salem witch trials cannot be fully understood without considering the broader social hierarchies and systems of oppression that allowed hysteria to escalate. Religion and cultural misunderstanding amplified her vulnerability. Puritan beliefs emphasized a constant battle between God and the devil, and any deviation from the community's strict norms could be interpreted as evidence of corruption. Tituba's background, her knowledge of spiritual practices unfamiliar to the Puritans, and her outsider status transformed her into a symbol of evil in the collective imagination. What might have been cultural difference or personal experience was reframed as malevolence, illustrating how fear and religious extremism can distort perception and justice. Her story underscores how social and religious power can define moral narratives, often at the expense of truth. The impact of her testimony extended far beyond her own life. By providing detailed accounts of alleged witchcraft, naming others, and describing conspiracies, Tituba gave the court a narrative that escalated the trial. Her coerced words became a blueprint for accusation, spreading hysteria across Salem and creating a cycle in which more people were implicated, interrogated, and punished. Her testimony shows how an individual, even one stripped of power and voice, can unintentionally shape historical events through the way their coerced or forced participation is interpreted and amplified by those in authority. Her erasure from historical records adds another layer to her legacy. Despite her central role in initiating the hysteria, little is known about her life after the trials. This disappearance reflects how marginalized individuals are frequently written out of history. Their experience is minimized or forgotten. The silence surrounding her later life allows myths and stereotypes to dominate her memory, obscuring the coercion, violence, and systemic oppression that defined her action. This absence is itself meaningful, revealing who society chooses to remember and whose stories are considered worthy of preservation. Tituba's story has been reinterpreted over time, both in scholarship and popular culture. In some retellings she is demonized, reduced to a symbol of exotic witchcraft. In others she is reclaimed as a figure of resistance and survival, a woman navigating impossible circumstances with ingenuity and courage. This duality reflects the broader tension in historical memory. Marginalized voices are often filtered through dominant narratives, but the effort to recover them can illuminate previously hidden truth. Tituba's legacy challenges historians, writers, and society to question whose perspectives are prioritized and how stories of oppression are told. Her legacy also serves as a cautionary tale about the mechanisms of fear and hysteria. The Salem Witch Trials did not occur in isolation. They were the product of social, religious, and economic pressures, magnified by prejudice and reinforced through coercion. Tituba's experience demonstrates how individuals at the margins are often the first to be blamed, and how their lives can be manipulated to justify systemic control. Her story reminds us that fear can become a tool of power, and that legal and religious systems can be used to enforce social hierarchies rather than protect justice. Finally, Tituba's enduring significance lies in the way her story intersects with broader themes of American history. She represents the voices of enslaved people, racial and cultural outsiders, and women whose experiences have been silenced or misrepresented. Her coerced testimony, her marginalization, and her erasure all speak to the ongoing struggles around power, narrative, and memory in societies that value certain lives over others. In remembering Tituba, we are forced to confront the ways in which fear, prejudice, and systemic oppression shape both events and the way those events are remembered, making her story a powerful lens through which to examine not only the Salem witch trials but the ongoing impact of social hierarchy and injustice in shaping history. Tituba's story, while rooted in a small village over 3 centuries ago, resonates far beyond Salem. She embodies the consequences of fear, weaponized by authority, the vulnerability of those marginalized by race, gender, and social status, and the human cost of systemic injustice. Her coerced testimony sparked hysteria, yet it also reveals the resilience of a woman navigating impossible circumstances, surviving when so many around her could not. The tragedy of her life lies not in any alleged sin, but in a society willing to exploit her difference, erase her agency, and silence her story. Remembering Tituba forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that history is written by the powerful, that fear can justify cruelty, and that marginalized voices are often lost unless actively sought out. Her life is a testament to the human cost of scapegoating, the destructive power of hysteria, and the need to challenge prejudice in all its forms. In reclaiming her story, we honor not only her survival but the countless others whose lives were shaped and often destroyed by the same forces of oppression. Tituba reminds us that history is never neutral. It is a mirror reflecting society's fears, biases, and hierarchy. Her legacy is a call to recognize injustice, to question narratives shaped by power, and to listen to those whose voices have been silent. The Salem witch trials may have ended, but the lessons of Tituba's life endure. Fear, unchecked, becomes tyranny, difference becomes danger in the eyes of the powerful, and survival itself can be an act of resistance. Her story is not just history, it is a warning, a lesson and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of relentless oppression.